Thank you for joining for another episode of Rob Anderson, Overnight. The third part of a reading of the Wikipedia article on the African theologian, Augustine of Hippo, a brief summary of his philosophy, works, and influences. We wish to thank the fine folks at Wikipedia for producing such quality content. Please support Wikipedia and their noble program. And now, our reading.
Augustine's philosophy. Augustine's contemporaries often believed astrology to be an exact and genuine science. Its practitioners were regarded as true men of learning and called mathematici. Astrology played a prominent part in Manichaean doctrine, and Augustine himself was attracted by their books in his youth, being particularly fascinated by those who claimed to foretell the future. Later, as a bishop, he used to warn that one should avoid astrologers who combine science and horoscopes. Augustine's term mathematici, meaning astrologers, is sometimes mistranslated as mathematicians. According to Augustine, they were not genuine students of Hipparchus or Eratosthenes, but common swindlers. Epistemology. Epistemological concerns shaped Augustine's intellectual development. His early dialogues, Contra Academicus and De Magistro, both written shortly after his conversion to Christianity, reflect his engagement with skeptical arguments and showed the development of his doctrine of divine illumination. The doctrine of illumination claims that God plays an active and regular part in human perception, as opposed to God designing the human mind to be reliable consistently, as in, for example, Descartes' idea of clear and distinct perceptions and understanding by illuminating the mind, so that human beings can recognize intelligible realities that God presents. According to Augustine, illumination is obtainable to all rational minds and is different from other forms of sense perception. It is meant to be an explanation of the conditions required for the mind to have a connection with intelligible entities. Augustine also posed the problem of other minds throughout different works, most famously perhaps in On the Trinity, and developed what has come to be a standard solution, the argument from analogy to other minds. In contrast to Plato and other earlier philosophers, Augustine recognized the centrality of testimony to human knowledge and argued that what others tell us can provide knowledge, even if we don't have independent reasons to believe their testimonial reports. Just war. Augustine asserted that Christians should be pacifists as a personal, philosophical stance. However, peacefulness in the face of a grave wrong that could only be stopped by violence would be a sin. Defense of oneself or others could be a necessity, especially when authorized by a legitimate authority, while not breaking down the conditions necessary for war to be just. Augustine coined the phrase in his work The City of God. In essence, the pursuit of peace must include the option of fighting for its long-term preservation. Such a war could not be preemptive, but defensive, to restore peace. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, used the authority of Augustine's arguments in an attempt to define the conditions under which a war could be just. Free will. Included in Augustine's theodicy is the claim that God created humans and angels as rational beings, possessing free will. Free will was not intended for sin, meaning it is not equally predisposed to both good and evil. A will defiled by sin is not considered as free, as it once was, because it is bound by material things, which could be lost or be difficult to part with, resulting in unhappiness. Sin impairs free will, while grace restores it. Only a will that was once free can be subjected to sin's corruption. The Catholic Church considers Augustine's teaching to be consistent with free will. He often said that anyone can be saved if they wish, while God knows who will and won't be saved, with no possibility for the latter to be saved in their lives. This knowledge represents God's perfect knowledge of how humans will freely choose their destinies.
Sociology, morals and ethics. Augustine led many clergy, under his authority at Hippo, to free their slaves as an act of piety. He boldly wrote a letter, urging the emperor to set up a new law against slave traders, and was very much concerned about the sale of children. Christian emperors of his time for 25 years had permitted sale of children, not because they approved of the practice, but as a way of preventing infanticide. When parents were unable to care for a child, Augustine noted that the tenant farmers, in particular, were driven to hire out or to sell their children as a means of survival. In his book, The City of God, he presents the development of slavery as a product of sin and as contrary to God's divine plan. He wrote that God did not intend that this rational creature, who was made in his image, should have dominion over anything but the irrational creation, not man over man, but man over the beasts. Thus, he wrote that righteous men in primitive times were made shepherds of cattle, not kings over men. The condition of slavery is the result of sin, he declared. In The City of God, Augustine wrote he felt slavery was not a punishment. He wrote, "Slavery is not penal in character, and planned by that law which commands the preservation of the natural order and forbids disturbance." Jews. Against certain Christian movements, some of which rejected the use of Hebrew scripture, Augustine countered that God had chosen the Jews as a special people, and he considered the scattering of Jewish people by the Roman Empire to be a fulfillment of prophecy. He rejected homicidal attitudes, quoting part of the same prophecy, namely, "Slay them not, lest they should at last forget thy law," from Psalm 59 verse 11. Augustine, who believed Jewish people would be converted to Christianity at the end of time, argued that God had allowed them to survive their dispersion as a warning to Christians. As such, he argued, they should be permitted to dwell in Christian lands. The sentiment sometimes attributed to Augustine, that Christians should let the Jews survive but not thrive, which is repeated by author James Carroll in his book Constantine's Sword, for example, is apocryphal, and is not found in any of his writings. Sexuality. For Augustine, the evil of sexual immorality was not in the sexual act itself, but rather in the emotions that typically accompany it. In On Christian Doctrine, Augustine contrasts love, which is enjoyment on account of God, and lust, which is not on account of God. Augustine claims that, following the fall, sexual passion has become necessary for copulation. Sexual passion is an evil result of the fall, and therefore, evil must inevitably accompany sexual intercourse. Therefore, following the fall, even marital sex, carried out merely to procreate the species, inevitably perpetuates evil. For Augustine, proper love exercises a denial of selfish pleasure, and the subjugation of corporeal desire to God. The only way to avoid evil caused by sexual intercourse is to take the better way and abstain from marriage. Sex within marriage is not, however, for Augustine a sin, although necessarily producing the evil of sexual passion. Based on the same logic, Augustine also declared the pious virgins, raped during the sack of Rome, to be innocent because they did not intend to sin, nor enjoy the act. Augustine believed that Adam and Eve had both already chosen in their hearts to disobey God's command not to eat of the tree of knowledge before Eve took the fruit, ate it, and gave it to Adam. Accordingly, Augustine did not believe that Adam was any less guilty of sin. Augustine dispraised women and their role in society and in the church. In his tractates on the Gospel of John, Augustine, commenting on the Samaritan woman from John 4, uses the woman as a figure of the church in agreement with the New Testament teaching that the church is the bride of Christ. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her.
Pedagogy. Augustine is considered an influential figure in the history of education. A work early in Augustine's writings is the Magistro, that is, on the teacher, which contains insights about education. His ideas changed as he found better directions, or better ways of expressing his ideas. In the last years of his life, St. Augustine wrote his retractations, reviewing his writings, and improving specific texts. Henry Chadwick believes an accurate translation of retractations may be reconsiderations. Reconsiderations can be seen as an overarching theme of the way St. Augustine learned. Augustine's understanding of the search for understanding, meaning, and truth as a restless journey leaves room for doubt, development, and change. Augustine was a strong advocate of critical thinking skills. Because written works were still rather limited during this time, spoken communication of knowledge was very important. His emphasis on the importance of community, as a means of learning, distinguishes his pedagogy from some others. Augustine believed that dialectic is the best means for learning, and that this method should serve as a model for learning encounters between teachers and students. St. Augustine's dialogue writings model the need for lively interactive dialogue among learners. He recommended adapting educational practices to fit the student's educational backgrounds in 3 categories. 1. The student who has been well educated by knowledgeable teachers. 2. The student who has had no education. And 3. The student who has had a poor education, but believes himself to be well educated. If a student has been well educated, in a wide variety of subjects, the teacher must be careful not to repeat what they have already learned, but to challenge the student with material which they do not yet know thoroughly. With the student who has had no education, the teacher must be patient, willing to repeat things, until the student understands, and be sympathetic. Perhaps the most difficult student, however, is the one with an inferior education who believes he understands something when he does not. Augustine stressed the importance of showing this type of student the difference between having words and having understanding, and of helping the student to remain humble with his acquisition of knowledge. Under the influence of Bede, Alcuin, and Rabanus Maurus, the Catechisendus Rudibus came to exercise an important role in the education of clergy at the monastic schools, especially from the 8th century onwards. Augustine believed that students should be given an opportunity to apply learned theories to practical experience. Yet another of Augustine's major contributions to education is his study on the styles of teaching. He claimed there are 2 basic styles a teacher uses when speaking to the students. The mixed style includes complex and sometimes showy language to help students see the beautiful artistry of the subject they are studying. The grand style is not quite as elegant as the mixed style, but is exciting and heartfelt, with the purpose of igniting the same passion in the students' hearts. Augustine balanced his teaching philosophy with the traditional Bible-based practice of strict discipline.
Works. Augustine was one of the most prolific Latin authors in terms of surviving works, and the list of his works consists of more than 100 separate titles. They include apologetic works against the heresies of the Arians, Donatists, Manichaeans and Pelagians, texts on Christian doctrine, notably the Doctrina Christiana, on Christian doctrine, exegetical works, such as commentaries on Genesis, the Psalms and Paul's letter to the Romans, many sermons and letters, and the Retractations, a review of his earlier works, which he wrote near the end of his life. Apart from those, Augustine is probably best known for his Confessions, which is a personal account of his earlier life, and for De Civita Dei, the City of God, consisting of 22 books, which he wrote to restore the confidence of his fellow Christians, which was badly shaken by the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410. His On the Trinity, in which he developed what has become known as the psychological analogy of the Trinity, is also considered to be among his masterpieces, and is arguably one of the greatest theological works of all time. He also wrote on free choice of the will de libero arbitrio, addressing why God gives humans free will that can be used for evil. Influence. In both his philosophical and theological reasoning, Augustine was greatly influenced by Stoicism, Platonism and Neoplatonism, particularly by the work of Plotinus, author of the Enneads, probably through the mediation of Porphyry and Victorinus, as Pierre Haddad has argued. Although he later abandoned Neoplatonism, some ideas are still visible in his early writings. His early and influential writing on the human will, a central topic in ethics, would become a focus for later philosophers such as Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. He was also influenced by the works of Virgil, known for his teaching on language, and Cicero, known for his teaching on argument. In philosophy, philosopher Bertrand Russell was impressed by Augustine's meditation on the nature of time in the Confessions, comparing it favorably to Kant's version of the view that time is subjective. Catholic theologians generally subscribe to Augustine's belief that God exists outside of time and the eternal present, that time only exists within the created universe, because only in space is time discernible through motion and change. His meditations on the nature of time are closely linked to his consideration of the human ability of memory. Frances Yates, in her 1966 study, The Art of Memory, argues that a brief passage of the Confessions, in which Augustine writes of walking up a flight of stairs and entering the vast fields of memory, clearly indicates that the ancient Romans were aware of how to use explicit spatial and architectural metaphors as a mnemonic technique for organizing large amounts of information. Augustine's philosophical method, especially demonstrated in his Confessions, had continuing influence on continental philosophy throughout the 20th century. His descriptive approach to intentionality, memory, and language, as these phenomena are experienced within consciousness and time, anticipated and inspired the insights of modern phenomenology and hermeneutics. Edmund Husserl writes, "The analysis of time consciousness is an age-old crux of descriptive psychology and theory of knowledge." The first thinker to be deeply sensitive to the immense difficulties to be found here was Augustine, who labored almost to despair over this problem. Martin Heidegger refers to Augustine's descriptive philosophy at several junctures in his influential work, Being and Time. Hannah Arendt began her philosophical writing with a dissertation on Augustine's concept of love. Der Liebesbegriff bei Augustine. The young Arendt attempted to show that the philosophical basis for Vitus Socialis in Augustine can be understood as residing in namely love. grounded in his understanding of the common origin of humanity. Jean Bethkielstinen, Augustine and the Limits of Politics, tried to associate Augustine with Arendt in their concept of evil. Augustine did not see evil as glamorously demonic, but rather as absence of good, something which paradoxically is really nothing. Arendt envisioned even the extreme evil which produced the Holocaust as merely banal in Eichmann and Jerusalem. Augustine's philosophical legacy continues to influence contemporary critical theory through the contributions and inheritors of these 20th century figures. Seen from a historical perspective, there are three main perspectives on the political thought of Augustine. First, political Augustinianism. Second, Augustinian political theology. And third, Augustinian political theory.
In theology, Thomas Aquinas was influenced heavily by Augustine. On the topic of original sin, Aquinas proposed a more optimistic view of man than that of Augustine, in that his conception leaves to the reason, will, and passions of fallen man their natural powers, even after the fall, without supernatural gifts. While in his pre-Pelagian writings, Augustine taught that Adam's guilt is transmitted to his descendants much enfeebles, though does not destroy, the freedom of their will. Protestant reformers Martin Luther and John Calvin affirmed that original sin completely destroyed liberty. According to Leo Rukeby, Augustine's arguments against magic, differentiating it from miracle, were crucial in the early church's fight against paganism, and became a central thesis in the later denunciation of witches and witchcraft. According to Professor Deepak Lal, Augustine's vision of the heavenly city has influenced the secular projects and traditions of the Enlightenment, Marxism, Freudianism and eco-fundamentalism. Post-Marxist philosophers Antonio Negri and Michael Hart rely heavily on Augustine's thought, particularly the City of God, in their book of political philosophy, Empire. Augustine has influenced many modern-day theologians and authors, such as John Piper, Hannah Arendt, an influential 20th century political theorist, wrote her doctoral dissertation in philosophy on Augustine, and continued to rely on his thought throughout her career. Ludwig Wittgenstein extensively quotes Augustine in philosophical investigations for his approach to language, both admiringly and his a sparring partner to develop his own ideas, including an extensive opening passage from the Confessions. Contemporary linguists have argued that Augustine has significantly influenced the thought of Ferdinand de Saussure, who did not invent the modern discipline of semiotics, but rather built upon Aristotelian and Neoplatonist knowledge from the Middle Ages, via an Augustinian connection. As for the constitution of Saussurean semiotic theory, the importance of the Augustinian thought contribution, correlated to the Stoic one, has also been recognized. Saussure did not do anything but reform an ancient theory in Europe, according to the modern conceptual exigencies. In his autobiographical book Milestones, Pope Benedict XVI claims Augustine as one of the deepest influences in his thought. Oratorio. Much of Augustine's conversion is dramatized in the Oratorio, La Conversione di Sant'Agostino, from 1750, composed by Johann Adolf Hasse. The libretto for this oratorio, written by Duchess Maria Antonia of Bavaria, draws upon the influence of Metastasio, the Finnish libretto having been edited by him, and is based off an earlier 5-act play, Idea Perfecti Conversionistic Augustinus, written by the Jesuit priest Franz Neumayer. In the libretto, Augustine's mother Monica is presented as a prominent character that is worried that Augustine might not convert to Christianity, as Dr. Andrea Palin says. Maria Antonia Walpurgis revised the 5-part Jesuit drama
into a two-part oratory O Liberty, in which she limits the subject to the conversion of Augustine, and his submission to the will of God. To this was added the figure of the mother, Monica, so as to let the transformation appear by experience, rather than the dramatic artifice of Deus ex machina. Throughout the oratorio, Augustine shows his willingness to turn to God, but the burden of the act of conversion weighs heavily on him. This is displayed by Hus through extended recitative passages.
Thank you for listening to our episode, Rob Anderson Overnight. This episode featured a reading about the theologian Augustine, from the folks at Wikipedia. We'd like to know what you think. Please share your thoughts and responses, and join us for a future episode.